the globe and come to these events online, because, you know, it wouldn't be so possible for me to present in person. I think somebody might have their microphone on still, so if you can mute, there's a bit of a loopback. Perfect. And so it seems that there might be some people still trickling in, but let's not that be too much of a bother. And if you have any questions along the way, feel free to either raise your hand or put questions in the chat. I'll be happy to take those questions as we go along with this presentation. So today we're going to be looking at Azure infrastructure and particularly what that means from the perspective of Power BI. And if we think about working with Power BI, the fact is that more and more we're working with cloud databases. So we might be working with a data source that is Azure SQL, for example, or we might have some files in Azure Data Lake. We might have Azure Synapse in use, where we might also be integrating Power BI, or something like Cosmos DB, or even Databricks. The thing is, there are so many options. And when we try to connect to Power BI, we need to choose which data source we're connecting to. And of course, we hope that, well, everything goes well. We just connect to the data source that we want to use in our visualizations. We draw that data in, and we just start building kind of the insights that we need. But of course, not always it goes quite to plan. What might happen is that, sorry, I was a bit too fast. What might happen is that we run into an error. For example, we might get an error of access denied, or the server could not be found, etc. It depends. So that is really what we're going to be trying to find out today. How can we have these systematic methods of connecting so that we don't run into these nasty surprises that kind of come out of the blue and then we need to start troubleshooting? So to get there, we're going to start with looking at the Azure data services in general, and kind of we can find some categories there that make it easier to think about the connectivity part. Then we'll look at the connectivity from Power BI and what is the workflow when we work from Power BI and what different things we need to consider on the way. And lastly, we're going to talk about something called invisible infrastructure. And I think that is how we like it. When we really don't have to think about it, it doesn't smell, it doesn't bump into our face or anything like that. It just works. That's how we want it to be. We can just connect to the data sources that we need, and there are no issues. So that is what we'll be walking through today. And I will actually go back to my introduction at this point. I'm Heini Ilmarinen, and I live in Finland. So here it is 8 p.m. right now. It is quite dark outside already, and the winter is kind of coming closer. I can feel it in the air a bit. I work as an Azure lead at a company called Polar Squad here in Finland. It is a small 50-people company that specializes in DevOps. I'm a Microsoft Data Platform MVP and also an MCT, so I run some Azure trainings as well. And I'm also a third, or one of the 3 hosts in the Deep in Tech podcast. My actually favorite topic is definitely architecture, figuring how everything fits together. It doesn't really matter to me what is the particular topic, but I just really like and enjoy that kind of puzzle solving that is included in architecture. And my background is actually in mathematics. That's what I used to study before I hopped into IT. And yeah, no worries, no mathematics in this particular session in this time. And as you might have noticed, I'm a bit of a serial doodler. That's kind of how I process information myself. So I like to draw everywhere. So let's hop into the topic of today, and we're going to start with Azure Data Services and figuring out how we could think about them in a cohesive way. So of course, I'm kind of assuming a lot of you work with from the Power BI perspective. So we start from the point that, hey, we actually want to connect to some data source that might be in Azure. So whether it's data in Synapse Analytics or Azure SQL, it doesn't matter. Within Power BI, we have this massive list of different connectors that we can use. And then of course, if we needed to, we could also use some custom connectors as well. But there's a lot of integrations into the built-in data services that are available within Azure. So of course, it helps to know a bit about what is each of these Azure data services for. We have, for example, some relational database services like Azure SQL Database, Azure Database for Postgres. Also in Azure Synapse Analytics, there's the SQL engines too. And then we have more like file-based services, which would be in our Azure Data Lake storage, for example. So there are, to start with, there are different types of data services. On the other hand, there is also different ways that these data services might be hosted in Azure. So we can kind of start from that perspective. We can start at looking two different categories. So one option might be that we actually could have a virtual machine that we have in Azure in a virtual network, or we might have one of these data services that we more so on the list that we have there. And so to have our virtual machine, we could have just a virtual machine where we have, for example, SQL installed. And if you have a virtual machine in Azure, that actually means that you also need to have something called a virtual network. And that is what assigns IP addresses to the network that you're using in Azure, and it becomes your private network area within Azure. And within that virtual network, then you can link your virtual machines that you create, and they will have a network interface card, and then they can communicate through that virtual network that you have in place. So when we talk about virtual machines, though, with them, you can do pretty much anything. You can install any data software that you would like. So you have a lot of flexibility and you can configure the networking whatever way you want. But the other side of this is that actually then that means also you need to do a whole lot more of management yourself. So for one, you need to do the configuration of the networking. And I think most of us as Power BI professionals might not need to care about networking that much. So this is more for, it's good to know, especially when those problem scenarios come on your way. But this might not be something that we necessarily need to do so much. But that is what we need with a virtual machine. But we also need to do a lot of configuration on the virtual machine itself. We cannot just, we might have some base image that we use, we put it up from the marketplace, but we, for example, might need to configure the SQL server that we have running in there as well. And the other side there is that it doesn't get automatically patched or updated. So we also need to take care of that aspect as well. So it gives us quite a bit of work that we need to be doing as we work with virtual machines. So luckily, on the other side, we have all these data services that are a little more bundled and a little more easy to start to use. And I think in a lot of the data projects that I see happening, a lot of the times, if it's possible, people go with these data services, the platform as a service services that are available. And it is due to the fact that they are so much easier to manage. And a lot of the times there might be some capabilities built in that make it especially useful then to work with data. So luckily, when we use these services, it means that, well, necessarily we don't have to work with a virtual network anymore, but we could have a public endpoint for that data service. That means that then we are able to access it from anywhere in the world. But of course, on the other hand, we do want to control that in some way, that public endpoint that we have. We don't want whomever to be able to access the data that we have there. With these services also, we have less configuration to do. It is much, much quicker to put up a Azure SQL than set up a virtual machine and install Azure SQL Server there. You have ready-made it faster, but if you need to do any custom configuration,
I think we lost you, Heidi. Maybe her computer froze. Give her a few minutes to see if she can come back. Maybe she's still talking. Let me send her a message and tell her that we lost her. I also got to message her in. Let's see. Okay, I think she's working on it right now. There she is.
Can you see me and hear me again?
Yeah, I'm
Perfect.
guessing, maybe you froze or something.
Yeah, because I did not realize I froze at all, so I just kept talking. And then I started hearing you say that, hey, you froze, and yeah, did not notice that. What was the last thing you heard me say, possibly?
We were on the slide of the data services.
I think it was on the networking. You were talking about the
Yeah.
networking. No.
Yeah, right
All
there.
right.
Yeah.
Perfect.
VNets.
All right. So with virtual networking, when we're working with the data services, let's hope this stays a bit more stable. This is a networking issue, of course. Very good sample. It
And you feel
happens.
free to turn off your camera if that will help.
Well, it doesn't seem that it's my network connection, actually. It at least to me, it seems stable and it doesn't give any issues. But somehow, if there's any issues, just let me know and then I can try camera off. All right, so for the data services that are more on the platform side, there we do not necessarily have to have a virtual network in place at all. Natively, we get a public endpoint, but of course, we don't want necessarily this to be accessible from anywhere in the world by anyone. So we do, of course, then want to control that in some way. And that will be one aspect that we'll be talking quite a bit about today, how to secure that public endpoint from Power BI. And on the configuration side, we don't have to do a lot of configuration for these services. We just give some variables when we create them, and then all the configuration is done for us. The thing is, though, even with these services, there's all the time coming new configuration options. So even though it's less, there's starting to be quite many. For like an Azure SQL, you can configure the Azure AD admin or a SQL admin. So there's all kinds of options that we can put in place and make work with it. And the other nice thing here is, of course, that on the patching up and updates side, most of the time we do not have to handle that at all. Microsoft is taking care of that for us. So it makes our life quite a bit easier that we do not have to be taking care of that updating side of things. So kind of in general, if we look at the different data services, now I'm looking at very much kind of laying it out for the connectivity side of things. There are these two different categories that we need to look at when we talk about connectivity from Power BI, virtual machines and platform as a service services. So we'll look at those two aspects next, now that we start to look at, well, how do we actually connect to Power BI and how do we work with it? So let's start looking at kind of the basic workflow of working in Power BI. So we have some kind of data service. This wouldn't actually need to be necessarily in Azure, but somewhere. It could be on premises somewhere, in Azure, wherever. And most likely, even to this day, we start and work first with Power BI Desktop. We start to build some reports and we start connecting to that data set. And of course, to be even able to fetch that data, we need to first be able to connect to that data in some way. We choose the source that we're using, and then we give the options for connecting to that data source. And hopefully that succeeds and we're able to create that connection. And then we're able to just start grabbing and the different columns that we need for our visualization. And once we have built our beautiful report, then we actually always, of course, want to take that and share it to others. So in comes Power BI service. And this is a cloud service, so it is accessible over the internet. And that means that kind of the connectivity actually changes at this point. So when we publish to Power BI, now the fact is that, well, we still need to be able to connect that data source that we were working with. So if we're working first on Power BI desktop in the office, well, we need to be able to reach that data set. And then on the other hand, the Power BI service itself needs to be able to reach that data source as well. And let's look at this a little bit from different kinds of perspectives. So depending on what is this data source like, how do we approach this in different ways? Well, the first option would be that there is a public endpoint. In that case, it would be really easy to connect wherever we are in the world. We can just give the connectivity information and off we go, both from our laptop as well as from the Power BI service in the cloud. Both work just fine. But most of the time that is not the case. We at least have some kind of restrictions on where that data set can be reached from. Most of the time we don't have our databases just in the public internet and like, hey, here's our data, just pull whatever you need from there. So a lot of times we need to consider a few other things to be able to connect. And one of these ways that we can connect to our data sources, if it's, for example, behind a firewall, is that we have this kind of agent available for Power BI called an on-premises data gateway that we can install, for example, on a virtual machine next to our data set. And then through that data gateway, we are connecting to that data source that we have available. And so this actually means that with this particular approach, we can connect to quite many data sources that might be behind some kind of firewall, etc. But a lot of the times we have to somehow make that connection from Power BI to be able to connect that. So if we kind of bring this together to, well, what does this mean for virtual machines? This connectivity. So we have our SQL server installed on our virtual machine and it has a virtual network. So we might not necessarily ourselves be managing these, but our data source could be in a virtual network in Azure. So first of all, when we're connecting to this data source from our virtual, our laptop, for example, and starting to work on it with Power BI, we connect to that. But how are we able to get into that virtual network? That is the first question. Well, behind the scenes, there needs to be some kind of VPN in place, for example, that allows us to actually get into that virtual network. There's a few other options as well, but I would say that VPN is the most common aspect that I see in a lot of the projects, and that might be what is set up, for example, between your office and Azure, and you don't really have to even care about it because it has been set up beforehand already. So that solves the problem of working on it from your own laptop. But how about when we then publish it to Power BI service? How do we connect there now? And in actually comes this on-premise data gateway. So we can actually have this installed on a separate virtual machine in the same virtual network as our data source. And then that is kind of what acts as this gateway between the Power BI service and then our data source that is in that virtual network. So that is what makes that connectivity between the service and the virtual network in place as well. So that's the first category of services. So there could be many things installed on that virtual machine. It can be a Microsoft SQL server, it could be a PostgreSQL, whatever you find a connector for from the Power BI connectors. So still we have the same pattern in architecture-wise where we need this data gateway in place to make it to function. But on the other hand, when we work with these data services, as said, by default, they have a public endpoint available, and that kind of makes it easy to access them. But the thing is, we don't, on the other hand, want to have it open to the entire world. So what we need is some firewall settings in place. And with these firewall settings, we can, for example, do some IP whitelisting. So we could just say that, hey, from my IP address, let me connect to this database. All right, perfect. Or I could actually even, sorry, that came a little too fast, but I could also allow certain virtual networks in Azure actually to access this service as well. But if I use just these firewall settings and I've just opened up like, hey, I can access that, after I publish that, that is not actually going to apply to the Power BI service because, well, we don't have an IP address for the Power BI service that we're using because it is a cloud product. But we have this setting that we can put in place that says allow all Azure services. And I actually have taken out the all from that text, but it actually says allow all Azure services. So that doesn't restrict it to your Azure services. It doesn't restrict it to like only Power BI or anything like that. It kind of whitelists all the Azure IP addresses that are out there in use. So if you open your Azure SQL, for example, to all those IP addresses, it's going to be a lot of IP addresses that are allowed. And so then if somebody wanted to actually attack an environment, they could use some Azure IP addresses and then do some shady business from there. That would be possible. And this setting would allow them to access it without any kind of filtering in place. Of course, in the SQL, we still then have like logins and so forth. So it's not like directly going in without any restriction in that sense. So do we have any better options for this, for these data services? How could we make it a little more secure? Well, luckily nowadays there is. When these services came out in the very first stage, there actually wasn't a lot of options in securing them because the nature of these was kind of like they are to be available through the internet so that we can connect them to our applications easily and so forth. But we have seen that that is not sufficient enough security-wise. So nowadays there has come this capability for us to link our data services that are not virtual machines and actually link them to a virtual network. And we can do this in two different methods. They differ slightly, but I think the general idea is that we can connect with a private endpoint or a service endpoint. And a private endpoint actually gives a private IP address to that service in your virtual network, whereas a service endpoint integrates it so that it kind of allows a specific subnet that you have within your virtual network to be able to access your data service. So that's the difference. So then it comes, well, now we have again this private network. So how do we again connect there? What is the solution? And now we have actually a different option than the on-premise data gateway. Of course, we could again put that on a virtual machine here and use that. But we remember virtual machines require management and configuration and updates and so forth. So we don't necessarily want to use them. But we have this other option that is called Virtual Network Data Gateway. And that is a managed data gateway that is handled entirely by the Power BI service. And we can link this to a specific virtual network that we have in place. And the one thing to note here is the last I checked, this was only available in premium and in preview still currently. So there's no, unfortunately, it might not be as stable as it should be at this point. But at this point, let's look at a few things in practice. Priscilla, can I check that I have time until like half an hour more? Is that correct?
Yeah, we're at 127 right now, so we're good.
Perfect. All right. So let's head and kind of look, how does this all come together? Because it's been a bit theoretical. So let's see how it all works. So I have created beforehand a SQL Server with a database with a sample data set. And it seems that I have been able to close my Power BI, or either I have it on the wrong screen. Of course, I have it on the wrong screen. Let me just actually do this. Just pop this. Where did it go? There we go. There is weird things happening here. All right. Are you able to see the Power BI right now?
Yes, I can
All
see your
right.
Power BI screen.
Perfect. So of course, when we want to start working with data, we choose Get Data. If we want to see the Azure specific list, then you can choose just to look at a few more options for which data sources to use. And it clearly seems that my laptop is having a hard time today with everything open. It's like, what are you doing to me? There we go. So if we look at the Azure options, we see that there is quite many of them. And I had an Azure SQL database there. So let me grab that. And that will then ask me for some connectivity options in just a moment of which server do I want to connect to. So if I then look at my Azure side here, I have my SQL server. And here I can then check, well, here's this server name. Let's use that one. Grab that. I can put in a database name if I need to, and then I can click OK. And then it will try to connect. I think I took out my firewall rule beforehand, so we might actually end up in an error here that it's not able to connect. And unfortunately, it's a bit slow today. Yes, I get an error, cannot connect. It kind of shows me a little bit because I opened up the connection a little before. So it says, hey, with this IP address, I'm not able to connect to this database. So that is always a sign that, hey, we need to do something about the networking. So I can come in here to Azure. I find the spot for networking. And here I have all kinds of settings. So for example, I can just have selected networks allowed. I have an old IP address. Let's grab that out and put in a new one. And then I can just save that. So it allows my IP address to be able to access that. So if I now hit refresh, now it's a bit more happy, it seems. So now I can see all the tables that I have available here. I can access whichever of these I want to, and I am good to go. But right now I'm just using the networking features that are based on these firewall rules. And what that means is that, well, if I wanted to be now able to access this from Power BI, I would have to click this. And as I said, that doesn't have any restrictions in place. So let's look at today how we could, that I can click OK. So how could we set up this network-based virtual network gateway connectivity? So I am going to go to my resource group and let's create a virtual network. I thought this might not be something that you do every day if you work with Power BI. So let's just find virtual network. And that is what I want to create. So for a virtual network, you can almost think of it as a reservation of private IP addresses for you within Azure. And it is always this kind of private network within Azure for you. And actually, like another customer could have a VNet with the same IP address space. That doesn't matter. We can still have the same addresses, but of course, those two virtual networks will not talk with each other. So I'll just give a name and I'll take it's kind of massive. I don't think I'm gonna need quite that many IP addresses. Okay, let's take 25. No, I want to go the other way. IP addressing, a whole nother story. Let's add a few subnets, particularly for our Power BI gateway. And I want it to be part of this virtual network address space, but I'm just gonna use one part of it, so not quite use everything that's there. I can even make it a bit smaller. And at this point, actually, let's do that after the fact. So really, if you needed some other subnets, you have some other services you want to put into your virtual network, then it's good to do some isolation between the different subnets that you create. As with any Azure services, we could add some tags, and for now we can just create it. So creating a virtual network is actually quite easy. It doesn't require a lot other than the name and the IP addressing that you need for it. Just gonna click through here so we kind of get a cleaner spot. So the virtual network will end up here in just a moment. And while we wait for that, I'm just gonna go and actually confirm that we have the resource provider enabled that we need for this. So for this, you would need access to the entire subscription level, and that's not always something that we might have access to. So this could be something that you also need to ask someone else to do. So within the subscription level, you can find this massive list of resource providers. And these resource providers reference the different services that are available within Azure. And they kind of give the different capabilities that are available for those resources. And when there's a service that is in preview, oftentimes it's not like automatically registered. So you might need to come in here and register it manually. And that looks a little stuck. I'm just checking that you are still there. And not sure why it's not showing anything. Right. I'll just let that be for a moment and let's check. We should have the virtual network available. We can just double check here if the provider has been registered, because we need to associate this subnet that we created here. We need to associate to the Power Platform. So when we click this, there is this option to delegate here, subnet delegation. And we should find Power Platform net access links. There. So that's what we need. And what this essentially does is it gives the right to the Power Platform to be able to create things into this subnet. And so it kind of, you give the control of this particular subnet to somebody else and to the service in particular. And so it will really kind of create this connection from this gateway that it creates behind the scenes and puts it in here. So if you would get into issues at that point, you would have to come here to the resource providers, which today do not want to show up. And you could find that Power Platform resource provider and enable that. And after that, you would be able to then put in that delegation that we just put in here. So this is what you need to do to be able to use that for the VNet gateways that we're going to set up. So that's in place. What we next need to do is, if we want to create a virtual network data gateway, then we need to create one of those. And so previously, the only place to do that was here in Power Platform Admin Center. So there's this spot that says Virtual Network Data Gateway. But right now, this has actually come also into Power BI itself, which is nice because it was kind of jumping around in multiple places in Azure portal, in the Power Platform portal and Power BI portal, going back and forth, trying to figure out what to do. So I would say that this is a nice addition. I have an old one, but that is not actually in use anymore. So let's find oh, this is lovely. So actually this Power Platform provider was not in place yet. Was that the correct subscription? Let me check. Hopefully this. Huh, this one seems to at least do it a little better than the, yes, it's not registered. I don't think I can register with this account though. Yes, I knew it. I have an account that has a little less privileges and I have an account that has little more, but this one with a little more doesn't seem to want to do it. So let's try one more time. Please, thank you. So we want the Power Platform resource provider. And actually we can just click register. When you click it, it gives you all the information, like what API versions are available for that particular provider and what kind of things you can do and so forth. So that is being registered. And after that goes through, then we should be able to proceed with the gateway from the Power BI side. It takes oftentimes less than a minute, so not a very long task. Almost getting there. So what we have to prepare on the Azure side is we have to make sure that we have a virtual network and a specific subnet within that virtual network that we have delegated to the Power Platform service. And then to be able to make the connection, we do have to have this resource provider enabled in the subscription itself. So there's no way to just give it to that one virtual network or one resource group, etc. Unfortunately, so that has to always be done by somebody who can do it. And I think this is quite a typical thing that if you're working with just the data side of things, you will end up in an error like this if you try to do it, that you actually don't have permissions to do it. So in that case, you just have to ask somebody else to do it. So let's do it again. And now that problem should be gone. Yes, we have our resource group. And then we have the virtual network that we created and the subnet that's there. It gives it automatically like a default name that combines the VNet and the subnet. You can adjust that if you want to. And then you can give some advanced options about when it gets auto-paused and how many gateways are in use and so forth as well. So all I have to do is click save. And then that is, after that, that gateway is created. So that's all that is required for that side. I was checking the documentation, actually verifying whether it has been updated with how to do it in Power BI, but it actually hasn't. So the documentation might show something a little different than what I did here. It is creating. So while we wait for that to create, I'll just pop back in here. And remember, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them right away. So we have set up the infrastructure side. We have the VNet. We have the gateway coming in just a bit. We, of course, now probably also want to connect to our data set using that gateway too, because otherwise it doesn't really make sense. So one more thing that we need to do is that right now our SQL is still so that it is only has this public endpoint, and it can still have that, but we'll keep that and have our own local IP address added there as we added it before. But we'll then also add one of the options that I talked about, so the private endpoint, so that then we're able to connect to it over the virtual network. I kind of get a feeling that something is a little weird today. There we go. So there is this tab here called private access. You find a create private link option here. So I'll just take the name of the SQL server I have there, the private endpoint. This is what I meant to do. So I'll keep it in the same region that I did. We wanted to target the SQL server. And it chooses, since I started from the particular research group, it chooses the virtual network that is there. And actually, I would like the private endpoint to be in a different subnet. Sorry, I forgot that. So I'm just going to use my other view here. So go into the virtual network and add another subnet here. So we had already that one for the gateway, but it's just better practice to just in case have them in separate networks, the private endpoints and then the gateway itself. So let's call this data. And we can have, for example, let's go with that. So it's just another block from our entire virtual network that is used a subnet. And it's a kind of a completely full skill to how to plan the different subnets. You want to make sure there's no gap between the different subnets, etc., and find good ones from there. And yes, I cannot choose that one. Trying to get it to do a refresh without me having to go all the way back. I think I do need to go all the way back. Sometimes these views aren't the best at refreshing on the fly, which is a pity, because then it means more writing. So, luckily, there's not many things that you have to input yourself. It's pretty good at guessing the best choices that you might want to choose. So now we can see that second subnet that we put there. And I will also let it create this private DNS that it requires to be able to actually pinpoint the name of the Azure SQL to the IP address that we are creating with this private endpoint into the virtual network. So that's what the DNS does. So we'll let that create. And while we wait, we can just check on this. It has been created, good. So we can now see it. Oh, that's super easy. We can see the gateway that we created here, right? This one. Yes. No, is it this one? I think it's this one. I actually tried to delete the other one, but it didn't allow it. I wanted to have it a bit cleaner for you, but unfortunately it didn't. So the Power BI service communicates with this gateway, and then after it's able to kind of set up that connection, then we're able to use that for data connections as well. So that is almost done. Luckily, it doesn't take long, but what you might be seeing in this process is it comes into quite many different little components within Azure that you do have to set up. It's not just like a click and then Azure takes care of everything for you. There is quite a bit behind the scenes that goes on, which also then makes it a little tricky to, like, if there's any issues to troubleshoot and so forth. So let's take, for example, I don't necessarily need to do anything fancy today with the visualization. Let's, for example, grab those two tables. We are more interested in, can we get the connectivity to work? Then I trust that you are able to do the magic with the visualization. So let's apply that. That will take a moment. They're not massive tables, so it won't take too long. Just keeping an eye on the clock a bit here. So nicely, this will also bring in the connections between the tables. So pretty much whenever I get the data in, I can even combine the different tables to some kind of visualization we want to have in place. So how to verify it is communicating via the private endpoint versus the public? That's actually a really good question. And for example, when you use Power BI, you're not able to see that from anywhere. That, well, is it using the private or public one? So it is more like you need to know how the service that you're communicating with is set up. Is it possible to reach it over the public endpoint, or is it not? There is ways then to use command line and run a command called nslookup. So for me, actually, it will go over the public endpoint, whereas for the Power BI service, it will go through the gateway and into the private network. But you get like a different result from nslookup. If we have time, I will show you how to run that, and then kind of a troubleshooting skill that sometimes might be useful. So let's do this quite quick today. Let's, for example, take the name and let's take the list price. My laptop is seriously struggling. This is weird. So we'll just grab a few and just make it a bit bigger so that it's not so small. Here's the names. Let's put in the list prices as well. So then we could have the sum of the different kind of categories for the prices, for example. And of course, if you want to make it prettier or something like that, let's go with that. That looks nice. So let's save the changes and let's then publish these. Just that. And let's publish this report to Power BI service then. I'm going to put it into that workspace. So that will take our report to Power BI now. So now we haven't actually yet linked our gateway to that workspace. So if we go into Power BI and we go looking for our report here. So we have this Power BI gateway. If we go into the data set, we go into the settings. We see that, wait, we failed to test the connection to your data source. Because again, now it's trying to go through the public endpoint or since we don't have the gateway yet popped into this particular workspace. So it's saying that, hey, this is not actually working. So we want to come in here and say, hey, we want to use an on-premises or VNet data gateway and figured correctly. Oh, must be that I have lost my, we want to have the premium on. There we go. Save. Continue. That's okay. Let's go back here. So let's hope that made the trick. There we go. Even though I'm not sure. Now I have to check so I don't accidentally make a mistake. What was our subnet name? In that format. So it should be this one. Let's go in here. Some issues still here. So that looks right. This normally works directly without any additional configuration. Okay, now it shows online. So let's try again. That's a bit weird. Sometimes it, like, these are the times when I kind of see that it's not maybe in public, like it's not yet generally available, because it sometimes has these that it takes some time to get through. Yes, there we go. So what we do need to do is kind of add the specific data source that we want to use into this to this gateway, because otherwise it won't know how to connect to it. So we can, for example, call it this data source name. And then we need example basic. Here, this one. So we had Azure AD authentication in place for this. So we have to make sure that those credentials are there as well. And then we can click create. So we kind of link the gateway and the data source together so that they know that, hey, we need to be actually working together. And now it looks much better. There we go. Perhaps to this one. There we go. So we say that, hey, this SQL server that we're working with is that one. So now if we look at this, it's the error is gone. And if we come into the workspace, it means that if we also go into the report, that report also beautifully loads and doesn't get stuck into any kind of error, but is available. But as you can see, it is a few steps that we need to take, and you need to be kind of careful in which order you do and that the different steps actually go through. So to wrap everything together, just to kind of bring it all together, how do we actually approach this? Because the fact is that we can kind of have different kinds of situations that we come across. So how do we figure out what's happening? How do we make sure that the infrastructure stays invisible? And the first thing that we should do is really to know the big picture. So we should know, where is our data source? Is it a service that we're connecting to? Is it a virtual machine? If it's a service, is it connected to a virtual network? How is it connected? Because that will then determine how we also need to connect from Power BI, whether we first work from our desktop service or whether we connect from the cloud service itself. And then if you do have some say in what kind of services you use and how you connect, it's always better to use more simple options. So if we're okay with just having the public endpoint and the firewall settings, go with that. But if you need more security, then you will need to go through this virtual network setup. And even though this is a little more work, maybe in the initial phase, then it will ease the management in the long run compared to, for example, using the on-premise data gateway on the other hand. And then you are able to kind of, with these aspects, you're able to see if you do run into any issues. What you should be checking first is check the network connectivity. Are you able to actually like reach the data service that you need to get to? And then if that works, then you should be checking also the data access. So when you are actually kind of hitting the data service, do you have the correct credentials in place? So through this kind of brings us to the end of this session. We've looked at the different Azure data services and the different categories we can place them and the different connectivity methods we have in place. Then we looked at the general pattern of connectivity from Power BI to these services and what are our options with the connectivity. And then very briefly in the end, we talked a little bit about invisible infrastructure. And I do think we have just a moment I could show you how you can tell, are you connecting through the public endpoint or the private endpoint? So you can find the server name here. And so what you would need to do is you could run, for example, something like command prompt. I hope you can see any of this. Sorry, doesn't want to zoom. So nslookup is a command that kind of checks where can I find this name? So when I look at that, I will find aliases for it. So I can find the alias for the public endpoint, and I can also find the alias for the private endpoint because I did create a private endpoint for that. But for me, it's going to direct me to this public IP address. So this is where we can see this is from the public IP address range. If it would actually resolve to the private endpoint, it would show one of the addresses from my virtual network that we set. So it would be 10.1 point something, the address there. So that's where you would be able to distinguish, is it going through the private or public endpoint? So this is going to the public endpoint. So that is a useful command if you have any name resolution issues or issues with the networking and just trying to figure out like, where is my traffic going? That will give you the solution of where it goes. So with that, we come to an end. Thank you so much for joining. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something new. And if you want to connect, you can find me both on Twitter and LinkedIn as well. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Thank you.